think we'll start now. The lights tell us we'll start. My name is Neil Denari. I'm a teacher here at SCI-Arc, and I've been asked to introduce tonight's speaker. Wes Jones is a partner in the firm of Holt, Hinshaw, Fallon Jones. Mark Hinshaw, another partner, is also here tonight. I'm sure between them, after the lecture, they'll both be willing to take on the serious questions that they'll propose tonight. Wes went to Berkeley undergraduate and to the GSD at Harvard for a master's, graduated in '83, worked for Eisenman, Rome Prize, and other stuff, and is now working in San Francisco with their firm. They're being published quite widely now, and their projects are being built. The Astronaut's Memorial from last year is now under construction, and they've recently won a limited competition for a fairly large project, a chiller plant at UCLA, and they'll be opening a Los Angeles office. All that aside, I think the most important thing about them is the proposition and the urgency of the work and the seriousness with which they work and propose questions which may seem like they are part of history and more particularly to the 20th century, but I think when you look at the work and hear the words, the proposition is more distinguished than just some kind of continuous labor on a particular idea. And the work really does speak well. I must say that Wes is a big fan of words, and words are an equal kind of project and runs concomitant with all of the work, so they're not just some kind of overlay to the projects. They have their own weight and their own importance. So I'd like to introduce Wes Jones.
Thank you. Last time I was here, it was about 8 years ago, and the fire marshal had just cleared the rhomboids out of here, and there were a few still in the parking lot that we were invited to investigate. And we thought, this is really a bitchin' place. If you could have a place where the students could live and work in the same kind of environment that they're designing on their boards. And from what little bit I've been able to see tonight, it's really nice to see that feeling is still here at SCI-Arc. And I must say that though we've talked at much more, quote, august institutions and that sort of thing, I have a particular warm spot in my heart for this place because of the quality and the intensity of the investigation that's going on here, as embodied by teachers like Neil, for example. I have a few preparatory remarks, and then we'll be showing some slides. The way that the thing should go tonight is that the slides do not relate directly necessarily to the words. You're invited to make your own relationships. In some cases they do, and that will be obvious, but in most cases they don't. Rather, they are, as Neil mentioned, two sort of parallel modes of investigation or discourse. But I always find myself in the position where, as an architect who does try to think about what they're doing and why they're doing it, I feel like I always have to explain why that should be, because a lot of the expectations are that you get up there and show slides of your work and say, here's the front door and that sort of thing. So I jotted down a few things here. Architecture is the biggest thing that we do. We live in it, and it creates our world. We play God in this, and in doing so, we enjoy an awesome exercise of choice and take on an awesome weight of responsibility. Since architecture defines the world we wallow in, it follows that the quality of this is very important. When we look at our architecture or our environment, we see the state of ourselves. Enter here through gap and hedge, the distinction between architecture and building. And that is, architecture takes on significance as fact and intention and is seen to become a selective mirror of ourselves. It becomes celebratory or critical, but it's never neutral if it's to be architecture. The exercise of choice then ennobles architecture. It takes on another dimension in this. What shall we call the state of ourselves? How shall we celebrate or criticize? Today, the overwhelming fact of this choice describes the state of our profession. Now, what you'll be seeing is we'll start with a couple slides, and on the right, I think, in each case, there will be what we call an aphorism, which will be some kind of slogan that we feel describes some aspect of our work or the world, or something that explains why we do what we do. And then I will read a short text that then backs that up, as it were, and tries to flesh it out in a little more depth. We feel that these little fragments describe for us a mandate for architecture, or at least for ours. And they give to us a sense of completion to our work that just drawing pictures or building buildings wouldn't give otherwise. So I guess if the lights are going to come down, they could do that now. There are three key terms in this equation about the context for architecture, and each of these terms stands as the name for even more baggage that could be considered sub-equations. The first term is scale of understanding, and the baggage answers the questions about the importance of specifying the scale as that of human engagement in the world. Simply, this specifies the scale of an architectural reality, as, say, opposed to a scientific or metaphysical reality. This is the scale at which architecture exists. Though it may refer to ideas from these other scales of reality, it must express them at the scale of human physical engagement. What may be sensed, what may be seen, felt, heard, tasted, or smelled. What finally may be built. It is important to specify this because it describes the province of possible, useful formal reference for architecture. Architecture is a manifested thing, often a physical thing. It's a three-dimensional thing, and its reference will only be those ideas that can be coaxed into that condition at the scale of human understanding. This is the scale of the particular reality within which architecture is situated. The baggage for this second term is the idea that the reality matters, that somewhere down the line, architecture should be involved in some relationship with it beyond mere existence. In the most simple direct formulation, we would say that architecture is the expression, or the establishment, or glorification, or celebration, or critique in building of that reality as it is best understood by those people who give a fuck. When formalized, this reality context becomes a mythology, a cosmology, an episteme, or perhaps a zeitgeist. And when systematized like this, these accounts of the world become easily available to architecture as a codification of possible expression. And it is the defining tradition of architecture that dictates, in a Darwinian way, that the architecture which survives is that which best makes use of them, is that which roots its expression in these significant representative realities. The third term in the equation is the critical term. It modifies the second reality and casts it as inescapably mechanical. This reality that we have specified as being meaningful for architecture only if it is considered at the scale of human engagement in the world is not electively mechanical, nor is it inescapably otherwise. That reality which matters is mechanical. The common sense view of reality holds that what we call reality is precisely the external world of things, and distinguishes between it and the interior world of ideas and beliefs. No advance beyond this simple proposition is possible without a consideration of epistemology, though. A consideration of how these are related. A consideration of the knowing itself. Because in a larger sense, at the scale of human understanding, reality is what is known out there. The first and most obvious characteristic of this situation is the difference between the two. The gap between inside and outside, the knowing and the object of knowledge, between consciousness and this reality that is so important for architecture to be within, to know and express. Because of this gap, thought advances. Things are known, things are things, things are. Without difference, there would only be sameness and thus no thing. Ring. The point here is to establish the fundamental nature of this proposition. This difference constitutes reality, and so is at the heart of all thinking about this reality. Yet, how can thought advance across this impossible gap? If it could, there would be no difference and hence no thought, which is, of course, a bummer. Yet again, obviously, thought does advance, or we wouldn't. Man extends himself, his being, with his machines. This truth is rooted in the advance of thought. Consciousness, which creates the gap in order to define itself, at the same time invents a machine that crosses the gap, like a wall crosses the space between inside and outside. In such a way, both consciousness and connection can exist. This is the first machine, invisible, unthinkable itself, but located by the job it performs, predicted by the evidence it leaves, which is us, here. Through its filter, we define ourselves as subjects, things out there as objects, and the world, reality, as the relations between them. Consciousness is a relationship to another, involving the other, the consciousness of it, and the distance bridge between them. It rehearses the basic terms and structure of a relationship that we have externalized, institutionalized, as mechanical. The mind structures external reality in reading it. This structuring is the primal mechanical activity that we have institutionalized as our mechanical orientation to the world. Eastern philosophy, of course, defines itself in reaction to this. Mechanism is rooted in thought at three levels. The deepest level is that at which the first machine performs the miracle of gap bridging. The second level occurs when, guided by the structures created in the gap building exercise, we try to externalize this understanding in our characterizations of nature and natural phenomena. This gave rise to a proto-materialism during the Enlightenment, which held that the world was literally a machine, like an infinitely complex watch, and thus that it could be deciphered in the same way. One could figure out the mechanism of the world in the same way as that of a watch, by studying its movements. Materialism enjoyed its heyday during the early successes of the new science, and continues to inform our evolving common sense view of reality. But it was eventually supplanted in the views of the scientists themselves by idealism. But the movement from to idealism, Martin Leibniz to Kant and Heisenberg, is not necessarily a movement away from mechanism, but toward the recognition of an even more intimate link between apparent mechanality and the mechanical structuring activity of the mind, which casts it as important. Finally, the third level at which mechanality roosts in our understanding is that which now acts upon the world so constituted in the previous two levels. This is the level at which intention operates, the level at which man is a maker. In this sense, the definition of machine is expanded to cover every man-made thing, every exercise of intention, every creative act, every externalized bridging of the gap. Every intentional act, because of its intention, this purpose, this program, this function, can be seen as a machine for fulfilling this intention, purpose, program, or function. To the extent that we are human, we assert this by our making. We make because existence is a crossing of the gap, and our humanity is defined in celebrating that crossing. To the extent that we are human, that is inescapable. In case it wasn't obvious, the slides that illustrated that little aphorism were the astronaut's memorial, varying between study models and some of the DD drawings and the initial competition boards. The slides that will be illustrating this project are this aphorism are the Lifeguard tower that we did for a show at the Kirsten Kaiser Gallery with a bunch of probably the faculty here several months ago. In emphasizing the programmatic side of its relationship to the subject, man, we're not trying to resurrect functionalism, but to recall some of the aspects of the equation which gave functionalism so much appeal during its early days. In particular, we are mindful of the idea that the chief source for formal decision-making could be the act of accommodation itself. That is, that the satisfaction of the program supplied enough intentionality that form might indeed follow. The idea was that, in deriving from the program directly, without the intervention of convention or style, the main expression would be of this program itself, and by extension of the importance of this program. In this case, the visibility of intention, which always stimulates the reading compulsion, would here become the object of that compulsion. It is what would be read and thus glorified. And intention is, of course, a sign of man. But many have pointed out, Colquhoun most clearly, that program or function alone cannot conjure form out of the void. Form and function are two different kinds of things. Starting from one, you intend to get to the other. But you must start the process of form making within the world of form. There must be sand for the oyster. It is here, right at this beginning, that architecture reveals its soul. A split occurs from which erupts a series of oppositions that are between themselves definitive of architecture-ness. Functionalism was a project for healing that split, though according to this, to do so would obviously have been to deny architecture-ness. In this truth lies all the power and mystery of architecture. Architecture is simultaneously distinguished from building as a species of art, and from art it is distinguished by its utility. Between these, between art and utility, lies the ineffable gulf of architecture. The bridge between them is form, never quite grounding itself on either shore, yet struggling to reach both. So architecture has no form of its own, existing as it does between worlds of form. A transparency to function is a transparency to no thing. In architecture's relative location between these worlds, significance is generated, but not form itself. The form must always be supplied from outside of architecture. Inside architecture, there is judgment and critique, desire and law, but no form. Reality, institutionalized as the condition outside architecture, called nature, has always inevitably supplied this form. From animism to relativistic particle dynamics, mankind has always looked to nature for the external authority to bless his endeavors. And the changing face of architecture has always inevitably reflected the changing face of this authority, nature. In the early stages, when nature was strictly objectified, architecture represented the obvious appearance of nature. This was pre-classical architecture. Later, as the understanding of this reality, nature, became more sophisticated, architecture came to look beneath the surface, so to speak, for the real truth, to signify the hidden forces of nature that gave rise to the obvious form by manipulating the early vocabulary, at the same time relegating many of these earlier forms to the status of appended decoration or ornament. In functionalism, this trend was taken to an extreme. The goal was pure signification without any excess. The inherited historical forms were cleaned up, and science, via the products of engineers, became the source of truth. Now, when architecture depended on the representation of nature for its forms, its intentionality was apparent, and the forms were very accessible, but their significance was more abstruse. The relationship between the forms and the ideas they were supposed to express had to be spelled out. A conventional language was necessary to bridge the gap. Because there was no necessary or a priori relationship between a God-centered, value-ridden cosmology that demanded expression and a set of symbols, apparent natural forms, chosen to express it, a code had to be legislated. This code was, of course, the classical language of architecture. It was the goal of functionalism to do away with this need for a culturally based conventional code, to make architecture directly engaging and legible before translation. For functionalism, as opposed to the classical language, the forms themselves were perhaps less readily accessible, but the meaning given in their references to the engineer's aesthetic of efficiency, speed, abstraction, and more scientific understanding of the natural forces was communicated immediately. The optimistic utopian messages of rational, human-centered, science-backed modernity read through any confusion about what, in fact, these white, mostly plaster forms were. While there might have been confusion about whether an element was supposed to be a column, a smokestack, a wing strut, or perhaps the wing itself, one knew precisely what it stood for. But the mind wants to relish the words as well as the message. As we said in the beginning, in functionalism, the formal directive was reductive abstraction. The idea was to get at the truth of expression by paring away all the, quote, unnecessary excess of some opaque conventional system so that the object would be transparent to its function. Having by now situated this desire within the soup of structures that define architectureness, we can begin to see how a non-reductive functionalism might solve all the world's problems. We might see how an overtly programmatic formalism that admits or revels in the excess necessary for communication might combine the possible visual and intellectual richness evident in the arbitrary integers of a conventional language with the directness of understanding that a pre-conventional formalism seeks. The chaise lounge à rélage continu by Le Corbusier and Charlotte Perriand was first shown to the public at the Salon d'Automne of 1929. Modeled on a Bentwood chaise lounge produced by Thonet, this machine for rest quickly became an icon of modern furniture design. The grace, abstraction, and purity of its lines paid homage to the chief form givers of the age, the steamship, the airplane, and the humble objet de mass production. Reacting to the Academy's decadent penchant for decoration, Corbusier chided the eyes which do not see for missing the formal value in these examples. The chaise lounge successfully showed how this, quote, engineer's aesthetic could be applied to the objects of the everyday environment. Yet there was a reason these eyes did not see, or at least did not see architecture in these examples. The engineer's aesthetic is based on the value of efficiency, commonly translated as the transparency of an object to its function. This transparency, however, is contrary to all understandings of architecture as an expressive medium. Expression is only possible through difference, that is, through excess or paucity. Either of these is at odds with a transparent statement of function. By the way, this is a sort of souped-up chaise lounge that we did in the office that sort of does some of the things that the original one hinted at. And the images on the left are some installation pieces that we did at Columbia, the same time that Neil had his guitar shown there. The guitar actually would be around the corner in this one slide. This is not to claim, however, that the adoption of the machine as a visual referent by the modernist architects of this period was a mistake. It was, in fact, an entirely appropriate key to expression of their zeitgeist. But their interpretation of this referent, conditioned by an overzealous reaction to the visual excesses of the 19th century, was misdirected. Consequently, the revolution that was modern architecture took a wrong turn, we think. Instead of following the machine toward expression and engaging elaboration, architecture followed its geist into abstraction. How could this have happened? We postulate alien intervention. Sometime during the summer of 1917, Corbu was visited by aliens. They visited him because they were frightened by mankind's aggressive technological advance. Knowing that architecture was the means by which humans established their most extreme yearnings, the aliens steered Corbu in a direction that they knew would ultimately stifle future development. They realized that while human technology was developing at a very impressive rate, impressive enough to worry them, human emotional maturity vis-a-vis this development lagged far behind. The aliens knew that the only dependable impediment they could place in the human's path was misunderstanding. They knew that they could ensure stagnation and a continuous cycle of return with no advance by encouraging the humans in their continuing failure to embrace and emotionally integrate this technology. By keying the human's value system to the abstract side of the machine, they kept the machine at a distance and prevented its assimilation. Abstraction, though non-threatening, is alienating. This is how the human deals with threats. He abstracts them out of immediate personal relationship and into something that is more objective. Subjective humanity is the opposite of abstract. The aliens feared that once the humans accepted the machine as a true extension and glorification of their humanity, turning the negative impressions of alienation into positive celebratory expressions of engagement in the world, then the universe would be open to humankind and no safe place for aliens. This next bit, which is illustrated, I think, just by precedent images that we find compelling, is something that is occasioned by a question that we always get at lectures, which is, what about the computer? Implicit in this statement is the demand that architecture take account of this marvelous new thing, the computer. If architecture is a mirror for the zeitgeist, an idea that everybody secretly believes, but nobody will admit these days, and the computer is such a big part of that, then how do we express this fact in architecture? Do we make buildings that look like computers? Do we paste computers to our facades? Or stuff our programs fill with them? How can architecture express this new computer reality? The reality of the computer, and hence its formal possibility, is processual and methodological, not physical. The computer itself, its hardware, has no appearance. Despite the very impressive technological advances that have occurred in computer hardware, from the chip to the mouse, the reality of the computer has been something else, an idea that these advances only support. In our desire to reference the best truth possible in our architecture, we are led to strategies of signification rather than representation. Thus, we will understand that the best truth about the computer, its reality, is obviously not its gross physical appearance, and not even in the fact of its processual, software-oriented nature, but in a critical understanding of the character, the structure of that software reality. But even here we must also admit that we are operating in the realm of potential grammar rather than of form itself. The most that we can learn from a study of this structure of the computer are rules for manipulating other forms. Given the grain of sand, we might learn how to create a new or different pearl. An excellent, if unwitting, example of an architecture that demonstrates the possible influence or value of the computer in this manner is that of Peter Eisenman. His work of the last 30 years has been consistently produced by heuristic grammars that, once established and fed their grain of sand, have automatically churned out beautiful and disturbing structures. I'm sure Peter would freak if he heard this, but I'm obviously ignoring the particular intentions behind his buildings. But these rules, behind these rules rather, but the fact remains that these buildings are completely expressive of a strictly rule-guided formal manipulation. Their generation sounds like Fortran. If you've been to the office and you hear them talking about it there, you hear things like, if column B, go to beam A, slice, parentheses red, iterate loop to end, then slide every A, B, or C to leave trace X, initiate graph loop 2, go to 1, begin, etc. Again, this is not a negative thing that I'm saying. I'm just trying to illustrate how the computer is a possible form giver in architecture. In their researches into the structures of formness, these buildings have in many cases delved beyond a comparable research into input-output, problem-oriented program language to a compiler sort of language. And this is as deep in the computer structure as I believe anybody has delved. But given our sense that the best truths, the ones most valued for architectural expression, are the deepest truths, this still leaves us short of the real heart of the computer, where the real work is done, where the software touches the hardware. Past the program languages, past the compiler and assembly languages lies, yes, the machine language. This language is well named. It is a mechanical place-holding structure, a binary distribution of possibility that can only be described as a simple statement of mechanical choice. The place is either filled or empty. The light is either on or off. The wonderfully dense and apparently continuous fabric of the computer's reality, its language structure, is ultimately founded on a discontinuous quantization, a world of discrete possibilities that are related mechanically by a simple choice. The computer was born as a mechanical calculator, as an analytical engine. By this point, of course, we've gone beyond the scale of human understanding. Discovering that the ultimate reality of the computer is mechanical, that is, exists in the machine language, does not, however, make it automatically available for reference. If we follow this back up in scale to the programming languages, however, where Eisenman has already shown there can be some reference, we still find the mechanical idea to be intrinsic to the determining structure. Both the logic structure of the language, which is that of Boolean algebra, and the structure of the user's experience, which is the manipulation of elements and the performing of operations, are absolutely mechanical. This, if you're worried, is the last aphorism. And illustrating it is the tract house, a house proposal that we made for one of the numerous housing tract lots in Manhattan Beach. The machine or technology becomes political when it becomes mass-produced, when it becomes a consistent force in the lives of the polis, the lives of the masses. As such, it has been seen as an agent of domination, of mythification, normalization, homogenization, of all the things that makes man one-dimensional. All the things which take away his ability to think for himself, to imagine possibilities outside of the system he inhabits, or to imagine variety within it, to question the existing order, which is only a peripheral relationship to him, since the exigencies and efficiencies of production and marketing cannot respond to the concerns of individuals. Mass production satisfies everybody, but no one. It responds to the needs of the masses, but to no single person within the mass. Creates standards that fit no individuals. It prefers the body which can be measured over the mind which cannot. It addresses itself to functions which are unique, to functions rather than to experiences which are unique. It creates abstraction and alienation out of homogeneous multiplicity rather than opportunities for engagement out of individual intentionality. These are some pretty hard facts. And again, we must ask, what went wrong? And again, I think we must blame the aliens who set Corbusier on his path. A prime legitimizer of the systems of production that Marcuse, in these quotes, rails against is, of course, the modern architecture and mass-produced modernism that so gags us. Both borrow either form or their technique from the mass side of mass production. All these evils that have been attributed to technology and legitimized in architecture are a result of that direction chosen in the fateful summer of 1917. The economic values that have promoted mass production, homogenization, standardization have made the world more comfortable for more people, which no doubt is important, but at what cost? And what would be the cost of a solution? Is there a solution short of radical Ludditism? Yes, We think there is, if we can understand that all this is no fault of technology or the machine per se. If we can understand that common sense idea that technology is itself apolitical, neutral, that is, guns don't kill, people do. The politicization of technology seems inevitable because of its relationship to power and economics. But, as Marcuse himself points out elsewhere, this didn't necessarily have to become a negative thing. With the establishment of a consumer-oriented society by the deification of mass production, however, it was given a negative spin. This is arguably where we find ourselves today, where it seems so ingrained that we are helpless in our critique. Our dependence upon this condition to maintain society itself seems almost complete. There is hope, however, if we can distinguish between the disease and the body, and realize that either by itself is neutral. As Marcuse realized, even when he so apparently condemned technology as the disease, it is also possible to reverse the metaphor, to accept technology and its importance for society, and to cast society as a disease preying upon this then neutral technology. Amputation would be counterproductive in either case. This would take us back to the fateful summer of 1917, when the choice was made to establish, via architecture, the value of technology as that of endless reproducibility. In this deification of the quantity side of the balance, the fateful step was taken toward the irreversible politicization of the machine that eventually grew into the negative feelings of alienation that so inspired Marcuse. If, however, we could go back and change the value system to one which championed qualities, then the way would be open to turn alienation into engagement. Taking functionalism as a convenient statement of the problem, it is clear that we are talking about a replacement of its concentration on objective, quantifiable function with a concentration on subjective, poetic experience. It means a reorientation to the special possibilities latent in individual contexts, a recognition that all contexts are individual. It means, rather than an emphasis on commonalities that lead to standardization, promoting an emphasis on differences and unique conditions. It means, for example, making a machine that expressively supports and furthers the experience of taking a shower for a unique person in a unique place at a unique time, rather than one which supplies the requisite water pressure at the required temperature in a sealed, non-porous containment vessel sized to accommodate all humans of all sizes anywhere in space or on Earth. And architecture is the discipline that can do this without instigating the revolution that would cause the collapse of society as we know and enjoy it. Consumption and production of things could continue unabated as we overhauled the value system implicit in our environment. Because, try as it might to adopt the methodologies of production implied by its forms, contemporary architecture is still impossible to mass produce. It is still always custom made. Despite a formalism to the contrary, every building is unique. Rather than sticking its head in the postmodern sand, architecture could change the world to a place where even Marcuse might have been happy, by facing the problems he pointed out and working with them. Architecture is still the most noble, respected thing in the environment. It is still the biggest thing out there. In its essentially custom-made nature, it is still the most malleable thing. It can change. If we look around, it is the world, and it is the future. Thank you. I hope there are questions. Okay.
Preventing
How so?
So it's likely that the technology that you engage in, which you see as so prevalent, is being ignored mostly by terms like post-industrial age and communication age, which are much more engaging to that invisible and unvisualizable part of computer technology, only three dimensions, which I think threatens your ultimate engagement with all that constructed reality that you saw there. And I think it's more threatening than your possibly I would like to accept, like and it's changing the world more rapidly than your fine fingers could catch up to.
Well, I think that the computer revolution would and will occur whether we understand what we've been saying tonight and adopt it as a attitude. Because ultimately, like we were saying, the computer has no form of its own and stuff still has to be built. Somebody said the computer has to have a face. It has none of its own. And so, in a way, what we are assuming in our own work is that this will come to pass anyway, and all we've tried to do is articulate it in a way that gives us some kind of direction for producing our work. In other words, we like to say that we don't like to say, we're often puzzled when people call us radical or anything like that, because what we like to say is that we're engaging in a sort of an archaeology of a common understanding that exists, but nobody can see because they've all got architecture glasses on. And they don't see the basic mechanical orientation that people have toward the world anyway, that exists in the language, the words we use to explain things. And we think that ultimately, as the architectures that are established now peter out and the proliferation of styles kind of works its way into butter, that what will ultimately emerge is this rapprochement with the machine, with technology, with that mechanical understanding of the world, and that an architecture will emerge. And we're just pretending that, gosh, it's happening right now, and that's why our stuff looks that way, because we're just doing the vernacular that would be there if everybody took off their architecture glasses. By vernacular, I mean unself-conscious. Obviously, our work is pretty self-conscious, but that's only because it's semi-unique. I mean, a lot of people are playing around this idea now, but
I thought a vernacular refers to a place. I mean, a vernacular of a particular place. Are you referring to a place?
Right, that as well. An unself-conscious teasing of the forces of that place into unhiddenness. Any place.
So you're talking about all places.
Possibly. All places. But what we're trying to do is give a sense of, if you take off the architecture glasses and you take as your chief goal then a sense of engaging the environment in a way that technology or say science has been trying to do. And the forms that technology and science have created that are direct expressions of certain natural forces, those natural forces being the things that give rise to vernacular architectures throughout the world, then you immediately end up with what might be called regional architecture. Because although not everything will end up looking the same, all the stuff in Washington might have machines for shedding rain, whereas all the stuff in LA might have machines for sleeping out under the stars. I mean, in a very simplified way. That's kind of what we mean by vernacular. That there is no person. We're trying very consciously to eschew a personal style in this, and to be as within the realm of the ideas that we're trying to articulate. We're trying to say those aren't our ideas. That's just how everybody thinks if they thought about how they thought. Sorry. Well, no, that's a manufacturing process. Well, when we say we would like to raise the value of the quality side of the thing, the individual context, the individual experience, that is, value subjective experience over the quantifiable objective fact, what we're trying to say is you can create machines as objects for supporting experiences as well as functions. And all of those machines will be as unique as the experience you're trying to support, the mood you're trying to create or whatever, the context you're trying to tease out. And so we think that it's a mindset that machines have to do with mass reproduction. We'd like to generalize the understanding of machine and then redirect it to say that the machine is just the application of intention in the physical world to application of intention in the physical world resulting in some kind of object. The object doesn't even have to physically move or do anything or use energy, which is the dictionary definition of the term, but it just has to support some experience. And in doing that, if it does it in an expressive way instead of an abstract or reductive way, it should become engaging. It should become a sign of the person who had that intention, or the sign of the user for whom that intention was created, and thereby also break down the alienated aspect of machines. A lot of that alienation has to do with the fact that machines have become agents of mass reproducibility and therefore the agents of no individual experience. Which is? Sorry. Well, there's a term underlying. Basically, all of the words are only investigations in response to a feeling of authenticity that we feel when confronted with certain objects. It's a feeling that we call bitchin or boss. And it's a feeling that we get a sense of this level of authenticity in many of the images that we show. These are bitchin or boss images. And while we like to, when we look at the images, go to the original reason why we're looking at them and to try to understand what in them is there that is so expressive in an authentic way of an appropriate or contemporary understanding of the way the world is, which is what architecture is supposed to make visible. So to a certain extent, if we get lazy, sure, then we use the images just because they look like machines and like, wow, that's what we do. But when we're honest with ourselves, when we're trying to figure out what we're doing, then we look at the images, we look into them and try to figure out what it is about them that so compels us. What is it about them that's so different than the other images that people might use as precedents for their work, things to investigate. I didn't get the last part again.
You referred to something in the design as next step. And I'm asking where do you draw the line until you need to add something to speak to someone without having to use the limitations
Well, I don't think that we consciously add things. When, well, it's an excess that you discover in analyzing the forms afterwards. It's an exuberance that you would have in designing the thing that put the fins on the cars during the 50s that were literally in excess of what was required, but certainly gave them a sense of speed or whatever it was that the designers were trying to communicate back then. And what we're trying to do is say that it's okay in contemporary or modern architecture to allow that excess back into the design process, and that excess being the level of communication beyond that of just pure transparency to function. It's that sand in the oyster. It's that little bit of communication that says that this is not just a building, this is supposed to be architecture. You're supposed to see in that excess the intentionality that causes you to read it, that causes it to appear significant of something. And then whether the design is successful or not, you get something out of it. You read something into it or read something out of it. And again, it's not necessarily that you read what the designer intended or anything like that, but you at least get the feeling for the world that it's trying to refer to, I think. Well, excess is a quantity, not a quality, ultimately. I think that in that there is more a possibility for individual difference rather than regional difference. In other words, the regions will set the problems that will cause the process to be set in motion. The individuals that will then bring their spin to it that will cause them to exceed pure function in different directions depending on what their background is and what they're trying to express. Well, the first part, I think, was answered by the discussion we had just previously. That is that efficiency is not a value of ours. It is an engineering value that is related to economics. And efficiency, we believe, is the death of architecture. You have to go beyond pure efficiency. Pure transparent efficiency is a transparency to the function. If you want the thing to be expressive, to communicate, to be more than just merely satisfying a physical function, it's got to be more or less than the satisfaction of that function. That's why our machines are maybe bigger or more mean looking or more stupid looking or whatever than an engineer would have created. In the case of the Schaffelradbagger, the bucket wheel excavator, which is a strip mining machine, that's become a sort of mascot of the office. That thing supplies 25% of the electrical energy to the West Germany. It's just such a totally awesome thing that despite the fact that it's raping the landscape and all this other negative thing, you can't get away from just how utterly boss that thing is. I mean, how big it is and how expressive it is, again, of what it does. Sorry, we have only a slight political consciousness, and but we're working on that. Yes, as a how would you describe it? Yes, it is by itself stripped of all its political implications that tie it into the structures of economics and power, which all stem from the mass production side of the thing. If you redefine technology in our terms, it is inherently neutral.
But you would argue then that the introduction of the technology of nuclear power production is inherently neutral.
Again, we don't have a great political consciousness in our office, but I... But see, again, I think that the thing that is not neutral about nuclear power plants, perhaps, is their location or the lack of care taken, perhaps, for economic reasons in safety factors. But I think we're saying that the power source itself and the devices for tapping that are, of course, completely neutral. It's only the people that value them one way or the other.
So you would argue that nothing sort of structurally technological follows from the introduction of that very basic technology. I mean, it's in isolation, in other words.
Yes. But see, of course, you can't isolate technology out of the structures of power and economics. That's why we're saying that in order to understand that neutrality, you would have to, in some perhaps naive and utopian way, go back to that summer of 1917 and work on the value system that causes people to value efficiency and mass production, that sort of thing, over the quality of individual experience. And it's a tough question because the alternatives are perhaps less power or dirtier power or something like that, say, in that case. And in that, it all gets tied up into the messy question that drags everything into a political discussion ultimately. But by and large, in and of itself, there was a choice made at some point in time, obviously not by a single person, and perhaps, and probably not even consciously, to lead technology or have technology lead us in a particular direction. And hopefully, at some point in the future, or through the agency of architecture, slowly and painfully, one could change that value system and reorient it to a different attitude toward technology. Well, that's just in a way, that's a MacGuffin that we made up. We didn't want to pick a real date that would cause people to scurry off and try to figure out what did Corbu during the summer of 1917. That was the summer before the white cubes started showing up, basically, apart from the domino house. And so, I mean, it's obviously a fiction that we make up to help us explain stuff. No, that's what I mean. Obviously, with the exception of the domino house, it's before the white cubes that were abstracted beyond the Mediterranean vernacular effect started showing up. The stuff that started showing up in the...
This is a comment. I mean, I see a tremendous discrepancy between your interiors and your exteriors. Your interiors are, the two that I saw are very clear and not threatening. The exteriors are very...
We'll work on that. I don't know, we're confused. We're just trying to make it clearer for ourselves and to try to make other people understand why it is that we feel compelled to do this. The confusion, the lack of clarity in the work may just be youth or naivete or immaturity. But we have a definite sense of where we're trying to go. Although, I mean, we don't have an image of where it's going to be, because if we did, then that would be what we're doing now. But we have a compulsion to work within this particular direction, you might say. And whether we're successful or not is a matter of debate. We feel that we're getting closer to what we're trying to do, but there have been things that haven't been quite so clean, ideas that were a little messier expressed. We also have to admit that all being architects and having gone through the educational process and everything, it's hard for us to take off our architecture glasses too. And so many of the projects are tainted with architecture here and there. Not intentionally. And we understand that people perceive it that way. We are told that we make boys' architecture, and we've embraced that. That's pretty cool. We can get into that. At least it tells us what we're doing. Although I have to say the most macho designer in our office is a woman. But other than that, are there any other questions?
How much does film influence your aesthetic? Star Wars, and all that kind of stuff?
Well, I'll tell you, we actually feel kind of bad about film because it used to be that architects told the world what was going to be, what the future was going to look like. It used to be the architects that sort of set the style for an age. But nowadays, that sort of responsibility has been given over to film and industrial designers. In a product-oriented culture, that just sort of happens. And we have a dream someday of actually getting into film and playing the game from that end and making the films be more real, in a way that an architect could do. But I think that it doesn't film itself influences us not enough structurally in terms of, conceptual organization and that sort of stuff. And it's only in a few cases that the work of design in films influences us very much. I mean, we have a growing relationship with ILM, for example. We're working with them on a couple of projects right now where we're coaxing them into the world of architecture and trying to get out of them what they do so well on the screen. That doesn't amount to making spaceships and all, but it does amount to using light effects and that sort of thing in architecture. And we're hoping that eventually maybe this relationship could go the other way. Okay, thank you.
Before everyone leaves, there's 3 announcements. The first is Robert Mangurian and Marion Ray and the students who have worked with him in Italy for the last few summers are opening up an exhibition of Hadrian's Villa. It's in the gallery in the annex. Next Wednesday at 8 o'clock, normal lecture time, Jean Nouvel will be here and will present his work. And also Friday at 8 o'clock, Peter Cook, who is here with students from Frankfurt and London as well, I believe. They're working in Room X. He will give a lecture on Friday at 8 o'clock, and their students will be presenting their work on Friday all day. So please try to attend those things. Thank you. Next week, next Wednesday at 8 o'clock, Jean Nouvel.
Was it as painful this time for them?
No, I think like the students at Virginia got it 40 times better than they did here. It's strange. I don't know why I feel that.
Well, I don't know anything about
response.
Yeah, I don't know anything about the students here, but
They're more political.
They're too sophisticated to their own good.
I think so. Here?
Yeah.
They all seem to latch on to the doomsday, political.
Well, I'd love to.
No.